Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Anyone else? No? Okay. So today's lunch is being offered by students. I'm going to just talk about that super briefly, and then I'm going to introduce a student who's going to introduce another student. So but we're having a 101 with Erin Hollander, and I'm going to ask Russell Johnson, who's a third-year PhD student in the philosophy of religions and the organizer of the 101 series, to just give us a 101 to the 101s and introduce himself.
Thanks, Erin. This is the third year that UChicago 101s have been happening. We meet every 2 weeks, and a student just shares a lot about a topic that they know a lot about, pretty much off the top of their head with usually little preparation. And then everyone else who doesn't know anything about that topic and is not wearing shoes and is sitting around in a big circle asks them very basic, stupid questions. So that's the way how it's gone. We've had a lot of fun over the past few years. I've learned a lot about topics that I otherwise would know nothing about. We've got a few coming up. In 2 weeks, we've got a Taoism 101, and 2 weeks after that, we've got a Maimonides 101. So those happen usually Wednesday or Thursday or Tuesday nights, so keep your eyes to the emails. But we've been blessed to have this opportunity to have one on Wednesday lunch, and even more blessed to have Erin Hollander, who
is very well prepared.
He is very well prepared. Usually the one we've got like sun chips and a handle of Jameson. So Erin stepped it up to match the occasion. He's a fifth-year PhD student in theology, and he studied Ecumenism over several different countries, and he's here to share with us. So please welcome Erin.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Russell. Thanks, Taryn. After 4 years of attending Wednesday lunch, I finally made the big league, so I'm able to be here. One thing I've noticed over the last 4 years is that there isn't nearly enough assessment of the audience at Wednesday lunch, so I'm going to open with a pop quiz. Where is this quote from? I think we've all arrived at a very special place, spiritually, ecumenically, grammatically. Shout out if you know it.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Pirates of the Caribbean. From Pirates of the Caribbean, the end of Pirates of the Caribbean, film from 2003. And this was the first time I heard the word ecumenical. It was a good 2 years before I heard it again in a Peace and Conflict Studies class at Swarthmore where I was an undergrad, where I was referred to an institution called the Irish School of Ecumenics, different from Ecumenism or ecumenical, where I would go on to pursue a master's degree in ecumenical studies and meet a whole lot of people who identified themselves as ecumenists. So, in other words, what we have here is a whole lexicon. It's not just one thing that I'm trying to reduce, but give a sense of how all these different components of what ecumenical is and how it matters and who involves himself in it, in terms of whole family terms. Now, ecumenical appears, the word appears in Pirates of the Caribbean essentially as a joke, right? It's used to signal not anything about what ecumenism is. It's used to signal comically erudite but essentially meaningless. Is more or less how it comes across in a lot of venues, and I can attest I've become somewhat of a connoisseur of the variety of strategies people use to wipe the glaze out of their eyes. Hence the opportunity to introduce this. The word ecumenical, like the thing it stands for, functions by holding together a lot of incongruous and sometimes incompatible things, which makes it particularly interesting, but also particularly dangerous. I think like any ism, humanism can shelter ill-thought-through commitments and projects. And so part of my task is to kind of disentangle the different elements of what's going on. The most common sense of humanism is, in short, the conviction that divisions in Christianity are fractures in one church rather than divisions between several churches, and the commitment to bridge or heal those distinctions, and so to reestablish something called Christian unity. Now, we're already running into some problematic terms, among them reestablish. Another would be unity. But also the basic definition leaves out a lot. And so my goal here is to flesh out the picture a little bit. So I want to start by backing up. And I'm going to start with etymology and origins, not because I think those are determinative, even though a lot of people really want them to be. But it's a good place to start. It's a good place to get inside sort of how we got to where we are. So, oikumene, Greek term, the present singular feminine passive participle of oikeo, meaning to dwell or inhabit. So oikumene is that which is being inhabited, or dwelling place. And in the ancient world, in the Greek and Roman world, oikumene is often used to signify civilization. In other words, by contrast with the wasteland, the desert on the one hand, you see a contrast set up between desert and oikumene, civilized place. And on the other hand, between civilized people and barbarians. So the opposite of the people who lived in the oikumene were the barbari. Now the ancient oikumene of the Roman Empire had what a professor at Princeton calls a political order, a cultural ethos, both moral and philosophical, and a social dynamic which reached out by force and education to bring those on its boundaries within its field. So there's an assimilative sense to the classical usage of oikumene, and when the term reappears at the end of the 19th century, that assimilative sense very much haunts the project that would later become Ecumenism, and I think it's something that people involved in Ecumenism have to reckon with. But towards the end of the 19th century, the notion of oikumene comes back with a vengeance, and it comes back first in an essentially secular sense, to talk about a new kind of context, which is resonant with the ancient oikumene, but in a new sort of mode. This time without political unity and without a common culture of reference to which everything else was marginal, but still a field of, this is again from Charles West at Princeton, a field of forces of which everyone is aware and which pull us willingly or unwillingly into dealing with each other. So in other words, technology toward the beginning of the turn of the century does for a global civilization what Roman law and Greek culture had done in the ancient world. This global dwelling place. And the secular sense of ecumenical essentially became that which affected everybody everywhere, or even more, even less concretely, the affect that somehow everybody in the world is a neighbor to one another or a contemporary to one another. So when it appears first in Christian discourse is in the missionary movements at the end of the 19th century. And there are a series of world missionary conferences, purely Protestant conferences that bring together people from different denominations. And at this point, the usage of ecumenical is still essentially geographical. They're referring to the missionary project being dedicated to the entire world. We find in 1910 the watchword, the slogan, to evangelize the whole world in this generation. But by 1910, there's already a discomfort with the use of the word ecumenical in this way, because the conferences were still entirely Protestant. And whereas the first couple missionary conferences were purely thinking about the extent of their work, starting in 1910, you start to get a realization that maybe without the participation, and at this point, without the participation of the Catholics, the Orthodox, maybe this work that we're doing is insufficiently ecumenical. It has a global scope, but not a global participation. So while these missionary conferences didn't launch the ecumenical movement in a way that they're often considered to do so, they set a couple fundamental principles, which I think are still very much with us and are that have remained important even as what ecumenism is and how it operates and what it's looking for have changed rather significantly over the last 100 years. The principles I would highlight are a broad inclusiveness. So while the early missionary conferences were anything but broadly inclusive, they made a start. The primarily evangelical population of those conferences went out of their way to invite, for example, high Anglo-Catholics to participate, even at the expense of some of their own commitments, because the sense of broad inclusiveness was more important to them than the ease that would have been gained by having a conference full of like-minded people. I think you can start to see how that principle is actually rather transferable. And the other principle I would highlight is that cooperative endeavor, that coming together, talking together, and eventually working together didn't demand prior consensus, didn't demand agreement. That people could communicate and have a movement, ultimately, in which communication across lines of interpretive difference was the motivating feature, whether or not they would result in common understanding or agreement on the key issues at hand. So there are a lot of different ways to tell the story of ecumenism or the ecumenical movement. Different metaphors have been used to narrate in different ways what's happening, where we've come from, where we're going, and metaphors matter. Metaphors matter because when you get, for example, the ecumenical history narrated as a changing of seasons, you get both the sense of everything that comes up is new and fresh, and yet still this too will pass. So there's the story of the ecumenical springtime around World War II, what one theologian famously called God's terrible springtime, in which the very horrors that were washing over the globe were the opportunity for new kinds of thinking about identity and about collaboration. You get masterpieces like the Barmen Declaration in this time, which would later become sort of a very important contribution to ecumenism. There's the metaphor of pillars. What are the different pillars of ecumenism? As if we're building something stable that's going to stand the test of time. There is the metaphor of currents, where different participants, whether denominational participants or different organizations, are feeding in to something that is assimilating them together and turning them into something other than what they were. Now, I don't have time to do any of these, so I'm going to, instead of telling the story of ecumenism, pull out a couple of contemporary debates that have been addressed in numerous ways over the last 100 years, but are still really important today. And I'll try to get these organized in relation to one another. So the first debate, which was also one of the earliest and one that's still very much with us, is what is the purpose of something called Christian unity? And I can't even really get into the tangled web of what such a unity is, or what it might be, or what it looks like, or the multitude of ways that have been proposed to reach it. I promised somebody a 5-point plan for fixing the world, but I was kidding. But there are a lot of different answers to the question of what Christian unity is and why it matters and for whom. And different organizations have sprouted up and often been intentional with one another over how to go about this. So the first answer that was given to what's the point of Christian unity was evangelism. Christian division, the very fact of there being Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants, and actually quite a lot of Protestants who don't like other Protestants with the same name, that this is a scandal. That is a scandal in a missionary sense. In other words, that how will we ever convince the world to become Christian if we can't agree on what Christianity is, or should be, or how it works, or what it means, or why it matters? And also, what would it mean to stop basically sniping at each other in order to carry out God's purpose for the world? This is the original sense of what the purpose of Christian unity would be. Mission has changed substantially in the last 100 years, and I'll leave it behind at this point. But I'll come back to this. Another answer that's been given for what is the point of Christian unity is service. There's the slogan from the early part of the 20th century: "Doctrine divides, service unites." Now that's debatable at best, but a lot of people have made a lot of it, and so we get movements such as the Life and Work movement in the early part of the 20th century. Vatican II doubled down on, in a certain respect, that the purpose of the church is to promote the peace and love of God worldwide. Now, there might be some under subterranean or not so subterranean indications of what that looks like at Vatican II, but it was an important moment where conversion to Christianity took a backseat to carrying out the point of Christianity. And then a third answer that's been given is sanctification, in the sense that there's something about Christian unity that isn't about its products. It's not about what it's going to accomplish or what it's going to make happen in the world, but about a certain kind of wholeness that is expected of the religious community, given its identity. We've seen this concern come to the fore as Orthodox and Catholics have gotten more involved in ecumenism. And so we find articulations such as cooperation as a holy duty, derived from the anointment of the church as Holy Communion. Vatican II, likewise, suggested that theology entirely needs to be studied, as they put it, aspectu oecumenico, under an ecumenical aspect or an ecumenical mode. And what that means, for me, what that means is that the point of ecumenism isn't, in this vein, the point of ecumenism isn't changing something in the world, but changing something in the heart. And that transformation in the world begins with a kind of inner revolution, or an inner in the sense of community as much as in the sense of person. Right, ecumenism is not about products, but about authentic relationships and reconstituted identities. And that's something that's really rung true as I've participated in a lot of these conferences, especially when people can't agree on basically anything else. So there's a vital question to another debate, and the other one that I'll discuss before concluding. Especially interesting, I've had a bunch of people specifically ask me about this, is what's the relationship between ecumenism as this, so we're told, and so we've traditionally received, effort to reunify Christianity, and interreligious dialogue, which likewise has all sorts of reasons why you might do it, all sorts of purposes, all sorts of mechanisms, all sorts of umbrella organizations, all at odds with one another. But the question remains, even aside from getting into all that, what's the relationship between what's going on in these two? So the language of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue is often used, which suggests, reasonably, that ecumenism is an intra-religious thing, dedicated to restoring a lost unity. So, what's then the deal with interreligious dialogue? Is it something entirely separate? Is it, as many people have suggested, a wider ecumenism? In other words, that there's some central purpose to ecumenism, and then if we get around to it, we should also think about, developing relationships and restoring human connections and human integrity with people who identify as members of different traditions or their own different orientations toward the world. Is it a type of ecumenism? Now, the point often comes up, and this is a very important point, that studying and working to improve the relations between people who identify as members of the same religion, whatever that is, and people who identify as members of different religions, that's a different kind of interaction. It's a different kind of process. But it doesn't follow, I think, it doesn't follow that interreligious relations and interdenominational relations aren't different species in the same phylum. And then the question is, what is that phylum? What are we actually talking about with ecumenism besides the specific ends that it's looking for? So here's my take on it. On the one hand, if we look at ecumenism in the sense of a commitment, in the sense of a movement, ecumenism has always been an interfaith project. Always, always, always. And here's why. The missionary ecumenism, to take the first example, of the early decades was deeply concerned with the religions. Now, obviously, its stated goal was the evangelization of the whole world in this generation. So I'm not saying anything about what kind of attention it was giving to interreligious relations or what kind of orientation it had towards them. However, it was an interreligious project from the very beginning. Both its research and its activity took place at interreligious interfaces, and the research that went into those missionary conferences took those interfaces seriously. However, we happen to conceive of the purpose of what they were doing, its value, its how it's changed. Second, attitude towards religious diversity, the religions, theology of religions, global ethics. These attitudes and the differences in these attitudes have themselves been major sticking points in inter-Christian dialogue and debate. A good example of this would be in Ireland, where after Vatican II, the openness, the change in orientation in the Doctrina Nostra Aetate to suggest that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in the world's religions, setting entirely aside all the issues and concerns around that. The fact that that attitude towards interreligious plurality was changed in the Catholic Church became a proof text for Presbyterian and Baptist convictions of the anti-Christic character of Catholicism. So in other words, interreligious exchange is a major dimension of the historical processes that have made Christian diversity, purely intra-Christian diversity, what it is and how it continues to develop. Therefore, when engaging only in inter-Christian ecumenism, ecumenism has to deal with interfaith issues. If it's not looking at the whole picture. Then if we turn to the more academic side of things, and look at what's usually referred to as ecumenics, that is the sort of the research element of all this, the science of ecumenism. From a purely descriptive perspective, we can identify other kinds of movements that are interested in something a lot like religious harmony between different perspectives that aren't irreducible to one another, and reconciled diversity. It may not be improper to refer to these as ecumenical movements. That's a different. That requires a whole different set of considerations. But for example, the Parliament of World Religions, beginning in 1893 here in Chicago, is responding to many of the same signs of the times that the missionary conferences were responding to, taking the same sort of impetus for actually a very different end. The end of religious harmony opposed to Christian unity. But as these terms get less and less fixed, it doesn't seem to follow that these are radically different phenomena. And finally, if we're really taking oikumene seriously as a symbol, as an orienting symbol, this symbol of shared dwelling, of global commonality, in which interfaces at which there are real and irreducible differences that are nevertheless already bound together by the very fact of being human, by the very fact of sharing space, sharing community, sharing a political order, sharing an environmental order, then anything called ecumenism, anything that's taking this symbol seriously, needs to be not only interreligious, but transreligious. In other words, being able to understand and to facilitate communication and build sustainability or peace at all of the interpretive interfaces and fault lines that make our world what it is. In other words, real entanglement that is at the base of how ecumenism has developed and continues to develop. is neither a purely religious reality nor a purely religious concern. So ecumenism needs to account for that, anyways, in a variety of ways. So I'm not trying to convince you that ecumenism encompasses, assimilates, and sets the marching orders for interreligious dialogue. I'm certainly not trying to do that. But this is a live and contentious issue. And the three sorts of worries that are associated with this coordination, one that if we get all excited about interreligious dialogue, we'll either forget about Christian unity or replace it with interreligious mishmash, or assimilate interreligious dialogue covertly into a Christian project. All of these are real important concerns. Likewise, there are those on the academic side of things who are concerned with what I tend to call the syndrome effect, which is once everything is ecumenical, nothing will be. That's also a real concern. And then among the genetic fallacy community, where this isn't what ecumenism used to be, therefore this isn't what it should be. These are live issues. I'm happy to talk more about why I think none of these worries are determinative, but I won't. Ask questions about it if you like. So I'm going to conclude with, and then have plenty of time for conversation, because 101 in the spirit of 101s. So I wanted to address one of the questions that Russell sent me. I think it's a great question and a little more personal, which is, why do I study this stuff in the first place? Right? This is bonkers often, and it doesn't seem to have, it has a lot of people nodding enthusiastically, but not a whole lot of scholarship in the United States. My academic communities tend to be in Europe. So why do I study this stuff? Well, I did comparative religion in college, and the task there was to deal with multiple traditions on their own terms, consider commonalities, differences, how they're dealing in different ways with similar sorts of existential questions, how they approach different problems, how the context condition them. But at some point I started becoming uneasy with this approach. And it's because, not because I didn't see the value of approaching traditions on their own terms. Absolutely not. Rather, it's because I was losing confidence that they were quite so separate. In other words, what does it mean to compare something that's compare two things that are involved in each other's business and conditioning who each other are in history and in the contemporary world? And so I came to see ecumenical studies and had the opportunity to go off to Ireland and study it as a complement to comparative religions. In other words, having real respect for the real differences between religious traditions, but focusing attention on the ways that they're related to one another, the ways that they're entangled with one another. All the messy stuff, in other words, where religious communities are up in each other's business, where they're trying to overdetermine, or assimilate, or excise one another. All of this is what I take to be an ecumenical approach to the study of religion, even aside from what might be a more sort of core focus, which is the study of ecumenical movements, or the study of ecumenical relations as a committed project. I think there can be an ecumenical attitude towards really anything we study, because there's something that's a real academic virtue in all this. Ecumenism requires a stance. In other words, this goes back to what I was saying a bit earlier about the one line of argument that ecumenism isn't just about its products or about the effects that it has on a religious community, but it's about the stance taken into a relationship that hasn't worked in some way, and to approach it in a new kind of way. So there's a stance in ecumenism, which is a kind of, I see it as a sort of open-ended or improvisational attentiveness, kind of being with or being toward otherness that precedes any kind of dialogue, whether that's between denominations, whether it's between religions. There's something that changes in how we approach those interfaces. And so isn't determined by the contours of where those relations or where that dialogue takes place. All that's to say, if you think you share an interpretive framework with the person sitting next to you, whether that's here at lunch, or in class, or in the pew on Sunday, or in the Masala on Friday, you're kidding yourself. And we can say that the study of religion, I believe this, the study of religion, like the practice of ecumenism, begins with and depends on ecumenicity, a kind of readiness or preparedness to cohabit something without complacency, without determinism, and in ever-changing environments, and being ready to be changed right along with them. So I'll conclude with a brief anecdote. When the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Olaf Tveit, Reverend Olaf Tveit, met with Pope Benedict XVI in 2010, he gave the pontiff a small but symbolic gift. He gave him a pair of artisanal wool gloves from Norway. Now, the background to this is that in the past 20 to 30 years, the phrase ecumenical winter, or the winter of ecumenism, I was talking about the seasons metaphor for narrating the story of ecumenism. The language of ecumenical winter had been used frequently to mean that a lot of the optimism, or some might say naivete, that had characterized earlier generations of dialogue had given way to cynicism or identity politics or just exhaustion. But this meeting between religious leaders was meant to signal, as so many of these kinds of meetings have, a commitment. And that commitment wasn't to a particular kind of end or a particular determination of what the value of ecumenical theology or ecumenical dialogue is, but a commitment to stay together, a commitment to keep communicating whatever the environments, however the climate changed. And so Reverend Tveit invoked a Scandinavian proverb when he gave Pope Benedict the gloves, which I trust will make immediate sense to the residents of Chicago, and which I count as one of my favorite encapsulations of what ecumenism is. He said, "There's no such thing as bad clothing. I'm sorry, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing." Thank you.
So when I hear the word ecumenism, the image I get is of something like a bunch of denominations sending representatives to one giant conference somewhere in the world. Yeah. It's sort of like the UN, but with more robes. And it happens every 10 years or so, and they pass some resolution, and the people in the know celebrate or mourn. To what extent is that a caricature, or to what extent are those sort of meetings still the substance of how ecumenism works?
It's not a caricature at all, or rather, it's a caricature that, like caricatures, draws on real features and exaggerates. Ecumenism takes place in a lot of different kind of venues, and the big conference works because of the sort of principles that I laid out at the beginning, which is to say, you can bring together a lot of different people with a lot of different kinds of priorities in a common space that is hosted by somebody other than one of the people sort of setting the terms. So when you have a big global conference, it's a sort of safe space in a respect. That being said, there are also bilateral conversations. Anglicans and Orthodox have had a running set of conversations since the 70s, since the 60s, hosted by one or the other. So there's a series of meetings hosted in Moscow at the Patriarchate, there's a series of meetings hosted in Dublin at the Archbishop's Palace or wherever he lives. So in other words, it's not just the big academic conference. I think the other thing I would say about it is that, in a sense, the conference is just a venue that really where the ecumenism takes place, if you want to put it that way, is in between all of the components of the conference, in the coffee hours, in the pub, right? And the value of the big academic style conferences is that it puts people in one place, and lets them go from there. Yeah, Tim.
This is a maybe 101, even for 101 question.
No.
For the great church councils of classical church history, of Chalcedon, of Nicaea, scholars sometimes refer to them as ecumenical councils. Is this a retrojection, or at the time would that have been a relevant thing to call that meeting, and do you see that as influential in this later, in modern scholarly use?
Yeah, that's really important. It's not a retrojection. The term would have made sense, and it comes back to the classical usage of oikumene as inhabited world or civilization. In a couple of respects. I mean, the ecumenical councils were, on the one hand, meant to draw from the bishops in every place, that they're bringing together the people from the furthest reaches of the inhabited world, places like Baghdad and Ethiopia. The term has come to signify more than that, in the sense that it's become in Orthodox circles a synonym or a substitute for Catholic, that these councils are ecumenical also, not just because of their geographical scope, but also because they are discerning and putting forth conclusions on the nature of doctrine that is valid for the whole, that is valid for everybody, that has drawn on the perceptions of everybody, and the Spirit has moved them to produce a conclusiveness. Now, that may or may not be accurate, because there are councils, as you may know, that simply didn't have everybody, and that became a sticking point for later ecumenical discussions in the modern sense. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
How big of a difference do you see or think there is between, let's say, the level of bishops or scholars making decisions or passing resolutions about ecumenical ideas, and let's say the simple worshipper in a community somewhere? Because, for example, in the area I come from, it said actually Catholics and Protestants are not supposed to share communion, for example, but nobody cares.
Yeah.
They just do. And
it's a fantastic question, and it's a huge issue. It's one that's been talked about since the 1980s with some regularity under the language of reception, that one of the anxieties about the conference model, where there are representative delegates that go off from a home church and end up in some room and talk for a while and go back, is what's the good of this? We can have all sorts of conversations, we can reach conclusions, we can put out pamphlets, and then what happens to those pamphlets? Is this something that becomes part of the understanding of the community that sent the representatives in the first place? Yeah, that's a concern that's animated a whole lot of ink and a whole lot of talk. What you're bringing up is one of the possible developments, which is that the stagnation in ecumenical conversations has essentially already been left behind by people. We're here arguing over iotas in the filioque or in the homoousios definition, and people don't care. They've moved on. That's one possibility. The other, and this is actually some of the reading I was doing just last night was talking about this, that there are theological consensuses reached, doctrinal, that the delegates to these conferences come to understand or come to configure historical formulations in such a way that they do not contradict each other. We fixed it. Right? This happened also in the 80s with the concept of justification. There's a giant document on Catholic Lutheran joint agreement on the doctrine of justification. The problem with this is that the differences between the antagonisms, all the messy stuff at these interfaces between communities, they aren't just about the doctrines. And so you can reach an agreement on a doctrine, but what hasn't been addressed is the identity politics. What hasn't been addressed is the deep processes of psychology, of politics, of economics that have maybe or maybe not emerged from doctrinal differences or given warrant by doctrinal differences, but aren't dispelled when doctrinal differences are overcome. And one of the several kinds of approaches to ecumenics, in fact the one that I'm trained in from Ireland, really puts a heavy emphasis on dealing with, quote, non-theological factors. But what they're only starting to realize in maybe the last decade even, that these non-theological factors actually aren't all that non-theological. That the theology itself is inflected by them. And so there's a long way to go. precisely on that point. Thanks.
Good time for one more question.
One more question. Yeah.
You used a phrase which leads me to ask a question I would not otherwise ask. You said the phrase you used, I think, was different species in the same phylum.
Oh, yeah.
And I have the unfortunate tendency to grab onto something a speaker says, usually early in the talk, and go off and diverge and think about it and miss part of it.
I meant genius.
I was wondering, this separation of Christianity into different sects, whether there is any useful analogy to speciation within evolution. Is there any structure, any actions going on there that would be helpful in looking at the question of differentiation, separation of Christianity?
I think so. Again, in the spirit of metaphors matter.
Yeah.
It's not an organic process in any kind of the same respect. However, what we see in speciation, if I remember my college ecology notes, is that what begins as something very small, or maybe it's a geographical distance, or maybe it's a change in climate, results in a certain part of the community splitting off and beginning to change. And over time, that community, not necessarily not the individuals part of them, but the community no longer is part of the same species that it once was. As a metaphor, I think that's very useful, and it's useful not only for Christian division, but more broadly as well. This is one of the many kinds of religious entanglement that I'm talking about that isn't quite so simple as here are religions over here and here are denominations that are part of one religion. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in more of this, I would point you to Daniel Boyarin's Borderlands.
To what?
Daniel Boyarin's Borderlands, as a book that looks at the process of deliberate disentanglement between Christian Jews, non-Christian Jews, non-Jewish Gentile Christians, and what that process was like.
And any future re-entanglement, so to speak, of sects?
Not addressing that. I mean, I think one area where the metaphor remains helpful is that there are analogous processes in many religions around the sorts of, without getting too determinative about it, denominational divides. Mm-hmm. And there are those who want to draw on the insights of Christian ecumenism, into the methodological or the structural insights of Christian ecumenism, in order to develop analogous processes with different ends, with different presuppositions, but that rely on the same sort of priority of relationships, that rely on the same transformation of the heart in order to transform relationships and communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.